Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi has drawn what he described as a hard red line for the United States. Speaking to Al Jazeera, Araghchi said that while Iran has no intention of attacking its neighbors, if the United States strikes Iranian territory, American military bases across the Middle East will become legitimate targets. The statement represents one of the most direct and specific warnings Tehran has issued to Washington since tensions escalated following the June 2025 war, and it comes at a moment when nuclear negotiations between the two countries appear to be stalling. Araghchi was explicit about both the limits and the reach of Iran's capabilities. He acknowledged that Iran cannot strike the United States mainland, but stated that it can and will respond where American forces are stationed throughout the region. That includes dozens of military installations across the Gulf, Iraq, Syria, and the broader Middle East, where tens of thousands of US service members are deployed. The warning echoes Iran's January 2020 strike on the Al-Assad airbase in Iraq, which demonstrated that Tehran has both the willingness and the precision to hit American positions directly when it considers a red line to have been crossed.
Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. It's a privilege to address you at this distinguished forum and discuss the profound question of our region, Palestine. Let me begin with the fact that the region has learned through decades of painful experience and that the world is learning again at a terrible human cost. Palestine is not one issue. Among many, Palestine is the defining question of justice in West Asia and beyond. It is the strategic and moral compass of our region. It is a test of whether international law has meaning, whether human rights have universal value, and whether global institutions exist to protect the weak or merely to rationalize the power of the strong. For generations, the Palestinian crisis was understood primarily as the consequence of an illegal occupation and the denial of an inalienable right, the right of a people to self-determination. But today, we must recognize that the crisis has moved far beyond the parameters of occupation alone. What we are witnessing in Gaza is not merely war, it is not a conflict between equal parties. It is not an unfortunate byproduct of security measures. It is the deliberate destruction of civilian life on a massive scale. It is genocide. The human cost of Israel's atrocities in Gaza has wounded the conscience of humanity. It has torn open the heart of the Muslim world. And it has also shaken millions beyond it, Christians, Jews, and people of all kinds, all faiths. We still believe that the life of a child is not a bargaining chip, that starvation is not a weapon, that hospitals are not battlefields, and that the killing of families is not self-defense. Palestine today is not simply a tragedy, it is a mirror held up to the world. It reflects not only the suffering of Palestinians, but also the moral failure of those who had the power to stop this catastrophe, and choose instead to justify it, enable it, or normalize it. But Palestine and Gaza is not only a humanitarian crisis, it has become the platform for something larger and more dangerous, an expansionist project, pursued under the banner of security. The project has three consequences, each of them profound, each of them alarming. The first consequence is global. The Israeli regime's conduct in Palestine and the impunity granted to it have deeply damaged the international legal order. We must say this clearly. The world is moving toward a condition where international law no longer is respected and governs international relations. What is perhaps most dangerous is the precedent being established that if a state has sufficient political cover and protection, it may bomb civilians, besiege populations, target infrastructures, assassinate individuals across borders, and still demand to be regarded as lawful. This is not merely a Palestinian problem, it is a global problem. We are witnessing not only the tragedy of Palestine, but the transformation of the world into a place where the law is replaced by force. The second consequence is regional.
At the center of Araghchi's message was Iran's nuclear program. He stated that all enriched uranium will remain inside the country and that enrichment levels will be determined strictly based on national needs. Zero enrichment, he said, is completely off the table. He argued that even past bombings of Iranian nuclear facilities have failed to erase the country's technical capabilities, a reference to the coordinated US-Israeli strikes during the June 2025 war that targeted key nuclear sites, but did not, according to Iranian officials, eliminate the underlying scientific knowledge or infrastructure needed to rebuild. The insistence on retaining all enriched uranium inside Iran is a particularly sensitive point for Washington. Under the 2015 JCPOA, Iran had agreed to ship out the majority of its enriched uranium stockpile and limit enrichment to 3.67%. After the United States withdrew from the deal in 2018, and reimposed sanctions, Tehran gradually exceeded those limits, eventually enriching uranium to 60%, a level that non-proliferation experts say is a short technical step from weapons-grade material. Araghchi's statement that enrichment levels will be based solely on national needs effectively leaves open the possibility of further increases, a position that Western negotiators have described as unacceptable. Araghchi said Iran's nuclear dispute can only be resolved through negotiations, but he placed clear conditions on what those talks must look like. They must be realistic, respectful, and free from threats or pressure, according to his statement. He said Tehran is prepared to reach what he called a reassuring agreement on enrichment, one that builds confidence on both sides, but warned that coercion will lead nowhere. He described contacts with Washington so far as indirect and strictly limited to the nuclear file. And while he characterized the initial exchanges as having a good start, he cautioned that rebuilding trust will be a long and difficult process, given the history of broken commitments, a clear reference to the US withdrawal from the JCPOA. Perhaps the most significant line in the interview came when Araghchi addressed Iran's missile program. He ruled out any future negotiations on the subject, declaring that missile talks are, in his words, impossible, now or ever. The statement directly contradicts Washington's repeated insistence that Iran's ballistic missile capabilities must be included in any comprehensive agreement. For Tehran, the missile arsenal represents the core of its national defense strategy, particularly given the absence of a modern air force comparable to its regional rivals. Iranian officials have consistently argued that asking Iran to negotiate its missiles is the equivalent of asking it to disarm while surrounded by threats. Iran is widely assessed as having one of the largest and most diverse missile arsenals in the Middle East, with systems ranging from short-range tactical missiles to medium-range weapons like the recently tested Khorramshahr-4, which has a claimed range of 2,000 kilometers and carries a warhead between 1,500 and 1,800 kilograms, according to Iranian sources. These weapons are deployed from underground facilities operated by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, specifically designed to survive preemptive strikes. When Araghchi says missile talks are impossible, he is reflecting a consensus within Iran's military and political establishment that these capabilities are the country's primary deterrent and the one thing that prevents the kind of military superiority that he described in Doha as the doctrine of domination. The distinction Araghchi drew between the nuclear file and the missile program is also strategically important. By agreeing to discuss enrichment while categorically refusing to discuss missiles, Iran is attempting to separate the two issues that Washington has sought to link into a single comprehensive framework. This creates a structural impasse in the negotiations because the Trump administration has repeatedly stated that any new deal must address missiles, while Iran has now publicly declared that this will never happen. The timing of Araghchi's remarks is particularly significant. They came as the United States was simultaneously tightening economic pressure on Tehran through multiple channels. President Trump signed an executive order imposing secondary sanctions through tariffs on countries importing Iranian goods and services, citing threats to U.S. national security. The US Treasury also rolled out fresh sanctions targeting individuals, companies, and vessels linked to Iran, according to official announcements. And these measures came just hours after the latest round of nuclear talks in Muscat concluded without significant progress. Reports from officials familiar with the negotiations indicate that neither side moved far from their original positions during the Muscat talks, with Iran again refusing to halt enrichment, and the United States maintaining that any deal must include verifiable limits that go beyond what the 2015 JCPOA established. According to Axios, citing a senior U.S. official, Iran demanded changes to the format of the talks that Washington rejected, with the official describing the exchange as this or nothing, adding that Iran chose nothing. The characterization suggests a deeper impasse than either side has publicly acknowledged. The U.S. State Department, as previously reported, has urged American citizens to leave Iran immediately or shelter in secure locations, an advisory that continues to underscore the fragility of the diplomatic situation. The advisory specifically warned that U.S. nationals are at significant risk of questioning, arrest, and detention, and told dual nationals they must exit on Iranian passports. Combined with the fresh sanctions and the military posturing, the cumulative message from Washington is one of a government preparing its citizens for the possibility that diplomacy may fail entirely. Trump himself has sent mixed signals. He has said the United States is in no rush to strike a deal, but warned Iran that the consequences of failure would be, in his words, very steep. That combination of stated patience and implicit threat has defined the American approach throughout this round of negotiations. And it is precisely the dynamic that Araghchi appeared to be pushing back against in his Al Jazeera interview. The secondary sanctions signed by executive order are designed to force third countries, particularly major oil importers like China and India, to choose between trading with Iran and maintaining access to the American financial system. A pressure tactic that Tehran has described as economic warfare targeting the Iranian people. The U.S. State Department advisory urging Americans to leave Iran immediately remains in effect, and its language has grown more urgent with each update. Combined with the sanctions escalation, the military posturing, and the stalled negotiations, the advisory paints a picture of an administration that is preparing for the possibility that diplomacy may not succeed. Iranian officials have pointed to the advisory as evidence that Washington is not negotiating in good faith, but rather creating the conditions for a confrontation it can later characterize as having been forced upon it. On the broader regional picture, Araghchi used both his Al Jazeera interview and a separate keynote address at the Jazeera Forum in Doha to lay out what he described as the strategic context behind Iran's positions. He accused the United States of enabling Israeli dominance in the Middle East, saying current developments are not defensive, but designed to give Israel superiority over all other countries in the region. He described the situation in Gaza as genocide and called for comprehensive international sanctions against Israel, including an arms embargo, the suspension of military and intelligence cooperation, and trade bans. In his Doha Forum address, Araghchi argued that the Palestinian crisis has three consequences that extend far beyond the humanitarian dimension. The first, he said, is global. The impunity granted to Israel has deeply damaged the international legal order and established a dangerous precedent where a state with sufficient political cover can bomb civilians, besiege populations, and assassinate individuals across borders without accountability. He warned that this is not merely a Palestinian problem, but a transformation of the entire international system into one where law is replaced by force. The second consequence, according to Araghchi, is regional. He accused Israel of openly violating borders, breaching sovereignties, assassinating official dignitaries, and conducting what he called terrorist operations across multiple theaters with a sense of entitlement. He warned that if Gaza is settled through destruction and forced displacement, the West Bank could be next, and annexation would become policy. He described this as the essence of what has long been called Greater Israel, and posed the question of whether the region will accept a future in which borders are temporary and sovereignty is conditional. The third consequence, which Araghchi described as perhaps the most dangerous, is structural. He argued that Israel's project requires neighboring countries to be weakened militarily, technologically, and economically so that the Israeli regime permanently enjoys the upper hand. He pointed to what he called a system of enforced inequality. Israel expands its arsenal without limits, including weapons of mass destruction outside any inspection regime, while other countries are demanded to disarm, pressured to reduce defensive capacity, and sanctioned for building resilience. Araghchi argued that this is not arms control but a doctrine of domination. a system designed to ensure that one state maintains a permanent strategic edge while all others remain vulnerable. That framing is directly relevant to the nuclear and missile negotiations with Washington. When Araghchi talks about countries being punished for scientific progress and sanctioned for building resilience, he is describing Iran's own experience over the past 2 decades. The demand that Tehran halt enrichment and negotiate its missile program fits precisely into what he characterized as the enforcement of permanent inequality, a framework in which one set of rules applies to Israel and another to everyone else in the region. Araghchi called on the Islamic world, the Arab world, and the nations of the Global South to build a united diplomatic front. He urged the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the Arab League, and regional organizations to move beyond symbolism toward coordinated action, including legal support, diplomatic initiatives, economic measures, and strategic messaging. He framed this not as confrontation, but as preventing the region from being reshaped by force. The overall picture that emerges from Araghchi's public statements this week is one of a country that is preparing for multiple scenarios simultaneously. Iran is engaged in diplomacy through the Oman-mediated nuclear talks, but it is also making clear in the most public and direct terms possible that it has both the capability and the willingness to strike American positions across the region if attacked. It is keeping its nuclear options open by refusing to halt enrichment and keeping all enriched uranium inside the country. And it is categorically refusing to put its missile program on any negotiating table, now or in the future. For Washington, the challenge is clear. The combination of Araghchi's threat to target US bases, his refusal to negotiate missiles, and his insistence on continued enrichment leaves American negotiators with very little room to claim progress toward the kind of comprehensive deal that the Trump administration has said it wants. The secondary sanctions, the executive orders, and the military posturing may be designed to pressure Tehran into concessions, but Iran's public messaging suggests the opposite effect: a hardening of positions, not a softening. Regional governments are watching these dynamics with growing concern. Gulf states have signaled through diplomatic channels that they have no interest in being caught between American military operations and Iranian retaliation, according to regional reporting. Countries like Bahrain, which hosts the US Fifth Fleet, Qatar, which hosts Al Udeid Air Base, the largest American military facility in the Middle East, and Iraq, where thousands of US troops remain deployed, all face the prospect of becoming frontline targets in a conflict they did not initiate. The explicit threat to strike US bases raises the stakes not only for Washington and Tehran, but for every host nation in the region. The pattern from recent history reinforces the credibility of this concern. During the January 2020 retaliation for the killing of General Qasem Soleimani, Iran struck the Al-Assad airbase in Iraq with ballistic missiles, causing traumatic brain injuries to dozens of American service members, and demonstrating that Tehran will target US positions directly when it considers its red lines crossed. Araghchi's Al Jazeera statement suggests that calculus has not changed, and that if anything, Iran's capabilities and willingness to act have grown since then. If diplomacy fails and military confrontation follows, the battlefield will not be limited to Iranian territory. It will extend across the entire region, and the countries caught in between will bear consequences they did not choose. That reality is shaping the diplomatic calculations of every government in the Gulf, and it helps explain why several regional capitals have pursued independent communication channels with Tehran rather than relying solely on the American security umbrella. Araghchi's closing message at the Doha Forum carried a warning that applied equally to the Palestinian crisis and to the broader standoff with Washington. A region cannot be kept stable by allowing one actor to act above the law, he said. The doctrine of impunity will not produce peace. It will produce wider conflict. Whether that warning is heard in Washington remains to be seen. What is clear is that Iran is no longer speaking in generalities. The targets have been named, the red lines have been drawn, and the word from Tehran, as it has been for weeks now, is that coercion will not work.